It's a beautiful sunny windy day with not too many boats on the river, and I thought I'd take this camera for a walk around Hoveton Great Broad Nature Trail. Here we are coming into the entrance, and as you can see there's hemp agrimony everywhere, which is just going over. It's got these little fluffy seed heads, which are absolutely delicious if you're a marsh tit. And a month or so ago in August, it was just a sea of pink, absolutely covered in bumblebees, carder bees, mini minor bees, every type of bee you can imagine, and all sorts of butterflies fighting for space on it. Here is our warden's hut and our introductory board, and we've got a spectacular display of hops which are just going over here, which have been clambering over everything. We ought to be setting up a microbrewery. We haven't properly monetized the opportunity yet, but they have this lovely sticky central stem that lets them cling to everything. They're all over the reeds, and at this point the hops are so heavy that the reeds are starting to collapse under their weight in lots of places. So I'm just setting off down the trail, which is a boardwalk about 1 kilometre long, and it ought to be pretty easy to pass today. For the last couple of days it's been flooded by high tides, and for a lot of the winter there'll be parts of it that are underwater, and boards which bounce up and down as you walk on them, but I think we'll be safe today. Little detour here to take in the warden's boat. This is how we get to work in the mornings. We have a row along the river. A delightful commute. More hemp agrimony here, looking quite ominous now, unless you're a marsh tit. So this is a wet woodland. It's called Car woodland, and the main tree species that grow here are alder, especially Ulmus glutinosa, and then some willow. There used to be ash, but most of it's dying off now, and then occasionally in the drier parts we'll have some oak or some sycamore back near the banks there, but alder is the key species in this woodland. And it's a tree that's remarkably good at growing with its roots in water, and it has these nodules at the base of the trunk where it forms a symbiosis with nitrogen fixing bacteria, and so it's able to draw in nitrogen and then provide it to other plants within the woodland. So it's a really foundational plant that makes way for lots of other things to grow around it. And so you'll have a lot of alder and then grey willow in here. And then marsh fern, which is very common here and very rare everywhere else, or very rare in non-wet woodland landscapes, which is growing everywhere. And we're just coming up to a second really foundational plant of this sort of landscape, which is the great tussock sedge. And we'll see some better examples, or some bigger examples, as we go around. And this is a sedge that grows it looks a bit like a pampas grass, and every year the level of the tussock rises. And quite often they will grow to get hundreds of them, or dozens of them will grow together, very close to each other, and other plants can take root on top of them. and thereby be raised above the wet ground level. And so if you have lots of them next to each other, they can completely raise the level of the ground and encourage very different communities of plants to grow. Although on this site, we mainly only have them scattered around in 1s and 2s and 3s. So they're not raising the ground level wholesale. So most of this site is woodland, and it's what a lot of the Broads would look like if no one was cutting down the trees and managing the land to create reed beds and to create grazing marsh by cutting it or grazing it. And in some places we do manage the land, and we'll either take out shrubs that grow or we'll cut down reed beds every few years to ensure that not every part of this woodland succeeds through to closed canopy woodland. So this is a sedge bed that has got some bog myrtle and probably some alder starting to grow in it, but it still has lots of light coming through, and it's a lovely place to live if you're a reed warbler or a harvest mouse, or to take shelter from the winds across the Broad if you're a dragonfly or a butterfly. And on the other side we've got some saw sedge, which is a very important plant in Norfolk thatching. You can see the bending of each blade of the sedge, and that makes it particularly well suited to bending over the ridge of thatched houses. So you'll use reeds for most of the thatch, and then over the ridge you bend saw sedge. Its other main characteristic, apart from these beautiful flowers or fruits at the moment, is the fact that it has extremely sharp edges. So if you run your fingers along it the wrong way, you'll end up with a very, very nasty paper cut, which is probably why it looks so pristine, because nothing wants to try to eat it. It's very well defended. And here's some bog myrtle, which has a delicious lemony smell. We have that growing sporadically through some of our reed beds. A few minutes into the walk, you come out onto Hoveton Great Broad, which is a big broad which is closed to navigation. There are no boats on it, very few people fishing on it, and this walk is the only public access point to it. It's a very beautiful stretch of water, and when I look out from here, we've been seeing a great white egret over the last few days. Last week there was a young bittern experimenting with whether these reed beds would be a good place to stay. They're probably not wide enough to support a bittern over a long period. There are great crested grebe. I can see some now, which are here regularly. Marsh harriers often fly along the tree line, and this broad, like a lot of the Norfolk Broads, has suffered a lot from eutrophication, from pollution in the last few decades. But in the last 20 years or so, water quality levels in the Bure have improved, and that led us, Natural England, a few years ago to initiate a project to restore the Broad which has been going on since 2016, and it's been very generously funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and the EU Life programme. And it's sought to restore a greater quantity and greater diversity of plant life, and also invertebrate insect life and fish species. One of the main interventions that's taken place recently has been to dredge lots of silt from the bottom of the Broad, and to place it, to reposition it in new fen areas around the edge of the Broad, where it creates lovely new reed beds with purple loosestrife and milk parsley, all sorts of other lovely species, while the Broad itself gets deeper, and that means that when the wind blows across it, the seeds of plants that have taken root, the young shoots at the bottom, are less likely to get disturbed, and the sediment is less likely to get swirled up into the water, creating very turbid water. And through some combination of the restoration project, and also of longer term improvement in pollution control in the Bure over the last few years. Over the last 2 years, we've seen greatly increased plant presence in the water. And so things like rigid hornwort seem to be spreading really fast, and they will provide a space for water fleas, which are really important to hide. So those eat algae and help to keep the water clear. The water plants will also provide a space for pike, which eat small fish like roach and bream, and are really good in making sure we have a diverse and healthy food chain. But here you can just see the end of the water lilies, and this is a very popular spot for dragonflies. It has been through the summer. There are just a few residual migrant hawkers and common darters around now, and I can see all the holes from the beetles which have been nibbling away at the water lilies over the course of the summer. Purging buckthorn on my right, which is delicious if you're a brimstone butterfly caterpillar. That's where they lay their eggs. And what I think is an oddly shaped birch polypore on one of our fallen birch trees. So there's lots of dead wood through the woodland, which obviously rots away and provides homes for all sorts of animals and insects, and also is crucial, along with the root mass, to the peat formation process. So this sort of woodland, where everything has its feet in the water, is a key site for creating lovely brushwood peat, the sort of peat that medieval peat diggers really wanted to dig up and burn in 12th century industrialised Norwich. This is our turf pond, a little pond that was dug at the end of the 19th century and dug for peat. And these turf ponds are reliably some of the most biodiverse mini sites on the Norfolk Broads. This one has stoneworts in, which only appear in relatively clean water. It's got frogbit, it's got different types of pondweed, and earlier in the year we were finding all sorts of invertebrates in it, so great diving beetles and caddisflies, caddisfly larvae, and water boatmen are still appearing. We've got a slightly reduced population or diversity of population at the moment, but there are still stickleback fish and back swimmers and the odd dragonfly nymph. But it looks like still water, but there's a huge amount of activity under there. Lots of things eating and being eaten. We're just coming out now onto Larkbush Dyke, which is an artificially created dike, which we maintain, we keep open, because dike banks are a particularly good place for... Oh, was that an otter? For water voles and all sorts of plants, and anything that needs light to get through to it. And this bridge marks the separation point between Larkbush Island, which we're about to go on to, and the mainland. Larkbush Island is possibly pristine Carr woodland. It may never have been managed, whereas the woodland that we've just come through was probably managed up until World War One, maybe as grazing marshes, and it's grown through to closed canopy woodland in that time, and obviously after World War One there was a lot less labour available, and so a lot of the Broads, like other areas of England and Britain, will have changed in their composition. And looking out onto the Broad again, you can see the reed beds at the edge. Oh, you can hear the wind. You can see lots of reeds growing out into the water. I'm going to come into the shade of the woods so you can hear me. And at the edge of the water, you quite often get hover forming from lesser reed mace, so bulrushes and reeds. So you have land that forms from the root mass and floating on top of the surface. So this area that looks like land, but actually if you trod on it, you'd go straight into the Broad. And that's one of the ways in which new land will form around here. And so with healthier water conditions, if we were just to leave the Broad for a very long time, it would slowly grow in with vegetation. Back into the woods now, and there are lots of plants here that look very similar to things you'd find elsewhere and are slightly different. So we've just passed some water forget-me-not, and all of these nettles are actually fen nettles, so they have slightly longer, thinner leaves than normal nettles, and they have a crucial difference in that they won't sting you if you touch the leaves. They have a few stinging hairs on the stem, but there aren't enough predators in wet woodland like this to make it worthwhile to completely kit yourself out in a stinging outer coat. This woodland has had a path through it since about 1969, when Martin George, who worked for the Nature Conservancy, which is a forerunner of Natural England, decided that it was such a wonderful woodland that it ought to be possible for people to visit it. And so he laid down a path which takes us past lots of the most beautiful and atmospheric parts of it. And in some ways, I think it's a little bit like how you would go through Mesolithic woodland. You'd probably cut down some older trees and lay them down in the water so you could get through the wet undergrowth. Older wood has the property that it hardens when you put it in water rather than rotting away, which makes it particularly good for growing in wet woodlands, but also for use in wet woodlands. And here we've been doing some management. So this is an area where we have greater water parsnip, which is a relatively rare species. And in the winter, we cut away the top vegetation once it's finished flowering to let light through, just to allow this area to green up before the winter and to hold the ground together. And that will help the greater water parsnip to grow next year, along with everything else that grows alongside it. This is a royal fern, which is the largest type of fern in Britain. And they were largely destroyed by the Victorians, who like to use their bases to grow orchids in. But they've made a comeback, and we have just a couple here and then more at some other sites that are managed by Natural England nearby. Earlier in the year, we had lots of blackcurrant, red currant, raspberries, even gooseberry. Now we've got blackberries. So we've been very fruitful. And we're just coming up to a marmite plant, which some people love and some people hate. It's called water pepper. It's a very tangy and delicious peppery leaf, which apparently used to be used as a cure for scurvy. It's got very high vitamin C content, and it's had a very good year this year. Oh yes, now it's starting to hit. And we're coming out into the reed beds here. And you can see we've been scything away the sides in preparation for the winter. If we manage the path like this, it allows light through, which means that we'll have a beautiful crop of meadow sweet and purple loosestrife and milk parsley and all sorts of things here next year. And you can see a cormorant and a couple of black-headed gulls out on our raft, which earlier in the year was host to a colony of common tern. We had about 35 pairs nesting here this year. They fly over from West Africa and spend a few weeks from May to early August nesting. We have lovely little chicks and fledglings running around. It's a very busy nursery, and they all push each other around, and the parents will go off and catch fish for their children and try to avoid feeding it to anyone else's children. This is also a good spot for marsh harriers. I can't see one at the moment. and maybe an otter if you're very lucky. Although the water's a little bit choppy today. It's spider season at the moment. I'll see if I can find some webs, or it has been for the last couple of weeks. They've all been setting out their webs to catch the juvenile other insects, or not other insects, juvenile insects, invertebrates, which are just coming out into the world and don't yet know how to behave themselves. So we've had webs everywhere right across the path when you come round in the morning. We've got various bits of standing dead wood like this. Some of them have had woodpeckers nesting in them. And they can be very good for fungi. We regularly have to chop down trees which come over the path, but that's the only real management that we'll do, is apart from keeping some areas reasonably clear as reed beds. Most of this woodland is just left to follow exactly what its natural processes are, and there's very, very little human intervention beyond picking out some Himalayan balsam, which we do upriver of this site. But there are lots of things that we won't be seeing now. So there are deer, especially in the spring and the autumn, will be coming through, and we sometimes find fox poo or otter spraint. There's a common darter, female, I think female, and we've been seeing lots of juvenile small rodents, so bank voles and wood mice, occasionally a harvest mouse if you're very, very lucky. This is a slightly raised area of the walk, which is known as the peat island, and it's an area which wasn't cut for peat in the period when everyone was cutting peat, in the medieval period, let's say 850 to 1350, very, very, very approximately. And so it doesn't flood as much, and we'll have slightly different things growing here. Now we're coming out to the bridge at the other end of Luckbush Dyke. And here's a male common darter. beautiful. And in the next week or so, we're going to put in a periscope platform at this spot, so it'll be possible to look underwater and see what's in the dikes. We're hoping that it'll be possible to see some of the invertebrates that we find when we do pond dipping in the turf pond. So some dragonfly nymphs and some back swimmers and some water mites, and as well as things like swan and duck mussels. There are lots of mussels on the bottom, which we find when we do plant surveys. They come up on our rakes. And along here we have the last of the water mint. It's had a really long flowering season. And greater water parsnip and marsh bedstraw. Older buckthorn, another delicious plant if you're a brimstone butterfly larva caterpillar. More water pepper. And the water's come right up over and covers quite a lot of the woodland, particularly at the moment as we move into autumn and winter. Sometimes it brings little fish up with it. Sometimes we find caddisfly nymphs in the spring in these pools. So it's always worth taking a closer look at them. And here is a little patch of sphagnum moss, a little place where we have acidic instead of alkaline land. So there's sort of micro scale variation in the micro topography of this landscape. And maybe one of the last things to say as we come to the end of the walk is that probably one of the best things we can do here is to do as little as possible, and to not try to manage this landscape too much. Peat covers 3% of the Earth's surface and stores more carbon than all of the living vegetation put together. And an area with a 30 centimetre depth of peat will store as much carbon as an equivalent area of Amazon rainforest, very roughly speaking. And a lot of the remaining areas of peat in the Norfolk Broads will be a lot deeper than 30 centimetres. So landscapes like this are particularly important for conserving that. And here we are back at the mooring. Thank you very much for listening.